All right. Well, my name is Attorney Matt Parker. I want to welcome you to the webinar on identifying and avoiding senior scams. In this webinar, I'm going to review how seniors are often taken advantage of by scammers, why they're targeted, and what are some of the tactics that these scammers are using. I'm going to go over some of the common scams and give you some tips on how to prevent an older adult from becoming a victim. Now, this topic is always relevant, and it's particularly true in light of what we see happening during this COVID-19 crisis. The scammers are, quite frankly, everywhere. They're trying to take advantage of those affected by the pandemic. For example, there are scammers out there offering COVID-19 tests to Medicare beneficiaries in exchange for personal details, including social security numbers. There are also emails and phone calls from scammers that claim to be from the IRS, stating there's more stimulus money available if we give certain information to the scammers. So we need to be constantly vigilant about scams. It's an enormous problem. If you ever do any research on this, the amount of people that are affected is really shocking. And it's often an underreported problem because it is involving older adults, many of those who have capacity issues. So the annual losses, as I've looked into the elderly and how they're affected by fraud, the losses are in the billions. And what article you read or what source you go to, the billions could be a few billions, it could be much greater than that on an annual basis. Seniors, on the average, lose about $100,000 to an effective scam. Generally, they're targeted because they have a nest egg of savings that can be exploited. You know, the scammers aren't going to target people without a lot of money, so they're going to go after seniors. If they're alone or recently widowed, they may be a lot more vulnerable to scammers. Older adults obviously were raised in an era when you could be a bit more trusting of those who were contacting you, particularly on the phone. Seniors are often not able to distinguish a fraud from a legitimate offer due to deteriorating faculties. So there may be some dementia involved in the senior as they pick up the phone and start to talk to this individual. And lastly, seniors will often fail to report an act of fraud. You know, maybe the fraud will go on for a considerable period of time and they're not reporting it to anybody, perhaps out of shame and maybe the lack of knowledge about how to report with such a crime. And also, you know, an issue that I found is that often these seniors are living in an altered reality. I found it was very difficult for someone with capacity to understand how one could be so duped by what on its face appears to be an act of fraud, such as the lottery scam. I mean, the countries that are contacting these older adults are, you know, Jamaica, Nigeria. Why would anybody think that this person with an accent on the other end of the line who's asking you to send money to this country is actually going to turn around and give you money back? Well, if you do any research on it, the experts say it's not unusual for older adults to get conned, betrayed not only by the very clever people on the other end of the line, but also by their cognitive decline or emotional need. I have seen cases where the elderly individual responds to one of these sweepstake prizes, but otherwise is showing me very little cognitive decline in other areas. Seniors will often get the call to wire the money to one of these scammers, and they'll quickly run out the door to go down and wire them even more money than they have in the past. And I've seen children struggle to break their parent from the addiction to this lie. The effective scammer has essentially entered the senior's psyche and has become this friend of the senior, and the senior is unable to recognize the reality of the scam. And they are, in essence, living in an altered reality. I'm not a psychiatrist or a social worker, but I can tell you that one of the root causes is the isolation and the loneliness. A fact that for many seniors exists because they're not closely monitored by other loved ones. So you get a pleasant, very slick professional on the other end of the phone who's very friendly and engaging, and they enter the senior's life and they trap them with these kind words and attention and a feeling of connection. So even when the scammers are unmasked, many of these lonely people don't seem to care that they've been victimized. The scammer has seemingly filled some void in their life that was created by the combination of their emotional and mental deterioration. And I will say that those people who are well off, let's say they made a lot of money during their lifetime, they were very smart, they could have been physicians, they could have been financial people, their intelligence, their education, and even their training, their background doesn't seem to protect them. When their emotions and their judgment have been affected by old age or illness, they can be preyed upon by these criminals. Basically, a criminal can target any victim who happens to be vulnerable. Now, the fraudsters are using a variety of tactics to take advantage of an elderly individual. They can present themselves as very friendly and sympathetic and willing to help. However, they also sometimes use fear with some of their schemes. And so their approach is often dependent upon the type of scheme that they're using. So on this slide, you see some of the tactics that they're using, and these will weave their way into the various schemes that they've come up with. So I mentioned one already, and that's appealing to the emotions of the older individual. The scammers might offer something very desirable, such as the lottery, the free cruise, maybe some pill to lose weight, it's something involving finances and investment of some kind. Alternatively, they might claim that something terrible has happened. Your grandson is in jail, or you owe taxes to the IRS, and someone's going to come and get you if you don't do something very quickly. So their goal is to get the senior into this state, in this emotional arousal. They're emotional at this point because of what they've heard on the other end of the line. And again, someone with capacity who is an emotional center is not going to get worked up by this. They're just going to hang up the phone, but understand that the victim is compromised. And in many cases, if you get a phone call on the other end of the line and it's from somebody and they're saying something that might have happened to your loved one, you tend to get emotional as well. And so you have to take a moment to realize this might not be real. So understand if you can't discern between something that's real and not real, how that could affect you. Second item on this list is this idea of scarcity. What the fraudsters will do is they'll say, well, you know, this deal's not going to last. This is so popular. You better jump in right now. And if you don't take advantage of it, you're going to miss out where all of your friends are actually taking advantage of this opportunity at this time. Source credibility. This idea is that when they call up the senior, it's much more credible if they say we're from a particular trusted organization. So they tend to be, posing as a popular company, maybe Microsoft, or a popular charity, or maybe a government agency like the IRS, and that gives them legitimacy. Social consensus. The idea here is that we often base our opinions and we base our behaviors upon what other people are doing in our community. So fraudsters will use this idea of social consensus against the seniors. They'll make insertions like hundreds of people have gotten rich off of this investment. You wouldn't want to be the only one who missed out, would you? Reciprocity. This is the idea that doing a small favor for somebody in turn might result in a much larger favor. So the initial good deed that someone might do for an older adult, and then they turn around and they ask for a favor from the older adult, typically involving money. The older adult might be more inclined to help this person out because they have the idea of reciprocity in their mind. Often comes up with caregivers and the caregiver fraud. Distraction. Fraudsters know that, if you just, send a lot of information to the older adult at one time, they're going to be distracted and they're not going to be able to keep track of the facts that you're throwing at them. It's very effective when paired with emotional arousal. So you use an additional tactic here of distraction. So the fraudster can be very vague about the details of this investment and change the subject very quickly and confuse the older adult and get them to agree to the scheme before they really understand the details. Um, last one's called landscaping. I'll also call it leading questions because that's what I know it as an attorney. This is a conversational device in which the fraudsters are, in this case, using some sort of rhetorical question to get the senior to agree with them. It's effective because you're essentially backed into a corner after you keep agreeing with the person on the other end of the line. For example, the fraudster might ask, wouldn't it be great to be a millionaire? Or don't you want to leave a legacy for your children and grandchildren? Don't you want to get your grandson out of jail? You know, something like that, where you're leading the person into saying, yes, of course I want to agree with all of these things. And then once you get them to agree, you say, well, you know, don't you want to send so much money to me to help out and fix this problem? And so these tactics here on this list, they're not unique to financial fraud. In fact, if you read them, you think about them, they're used in a lot of sales techniques. Legitimate people can be using these for good ends. But the problem here is that fraudsters have taken these concepts and turned them into essentially a tool for committing illicit acts, acts of fraud. So if you recognize these influence strategies and maybe you start to hear some of these on a phone call, you'll recognize that, hey, there's something amiss here with what this person is telling me or my loved one. All right, so it's important to recognize some of the more common scams out there so you can recognize them. Maybe you're working with an older adult and they tell you about some sort of phone call they've gotten, maybe one of these or some variation on this will, come to mind, and you'll say, that might not be a legitimate call. So these are taken from the FBI's 10 most common scams. And so what you've got here, first of all, is the old romance scam. Here these criminals are posing as interested romantic partners. And in this context, what we're talking about is the new social media or dating websites where a lot of these crimes are being committed. In the past, it was the sort of what I will call a long con, where you would have, let's just say, a gentleman trying to take advantage of the old rich widow and work his way into her life with the plan of taking advantage of her financially. Well, now you can do this online. You could have essentially a fake profile online and attract scores of people to your profile. And apparently older adults are using these dating websites as well as younger adults. So this crime is being committed online as well as in person. So the fake profiles are created to build these online relationships and convince people to send money. There are stories out there, people creating wedding plans before they realize this is not actually a legitimate individual on the other end of the line. So certainly I would say any online love interest to ask for probably are welcome. The tech support scam, criminals are posing as technology support representatives and offer to fix computer problems, typically non-existent computer problems. The scammers then gain remote access to the victim's computers and whatever is on that computer. It could be sensitive information, or they could just be using the computer as a tool to engage in other crimes. So what happens in some of these cases is that fraudsters are often making telephone calls and claiming to be computer technicians associated with Microsoft, for example, or they may use internet pop-up messages to warn of computer problems. And again, most of us who have seen pop-up messages are going to say, yeah, these are not legitimate. But older adults are not as familiar with using computers as younger individuals, and are not able to discern between what is obviously a scam or a bogus ad. So what the scammers do is they say, hey, we've detected some viruses or other malware on your computer, and they ask the victim to give remote access to the computer, and you can do that. We have tech people who work for our companies, that they can get into your computer and fix things from a remote location. So they'll diagnose a non-existent problem, ask the victim to pay lots of money for perhaps unnecessary or even harmful services. Part of the tech support scam is also the refund scam, and the refund scam can come into any one of these where victims have made payments for these services, and then the perpetrators call back and say, hey, we're no longer offering these services, for example, and refunds have to be sent to the client. And so they purport to send money back to the victim. And then they say, whoa, 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 we actually paid you too much money and you have to give us some money back. And of course, they haven't actually given a refund, and therefore the client is fleeced again through this refund scheme. Comes up a lot with these various schemes that they're using. Well, the grandparent scheme I have here on my slide, posing as a relative, usually a grandchild, but if you look online, it's called the grandparent scheme. Usually what happens in this case is that the scammers are going to place a call to an older adult, and when the older adult picks up the phone, they'll say something like, "Hi, Grandma, do you know who this is?" And the unsuspecting grandparent guesses the name of the grandchild. Is this Bobby? And then, of course, they'll say, "Yes, Grandma, it's Bobby." And I've often marveled at this. They must be recruiting people who sound young. It's not like a 40 or 50-year-old person could pull this off. If you got grandkids or teenage age or something along that line, you must have people working with scammers who are kids. Really amazing, the depravity that these people will go to. But nevertheless, once they're in, once the identity has been established, they'll ask for money to fix some problem that's come up. There's overdue rent, there's car repairs, they're in trouble somehow, and they'll ask the money to be sent via Western Union or MoneyGram. And of course, those you don't always need an ID on the other end of the line to collect the funds. And then they say, "Don't tell my parents, the parents will kill me." And, a lot of times the grandparents figure out after the fact this was bogus. But by that time, the money is gone. The government impersonation scam, the criminals here are posing as government employees, and they threaten to arrest or prosecute victims if they don't agree to provide funds or other payments. So the popular one in the last decade, most of us have heard about, is the IRS imposter scams, where they're placing some very aggressive phone calls to older adults and claiming to be employees of the IRS. Sometimes they'll use fake names and bogus IRS identification badges that sound very legitimate on the other end of the line. And they'll be told that they owe money to the IRS and they have to be paid, of course, again, through a wire transfer, or in some cases, gift cards. I mean, those of us who have paid taxes throughout all of our years, we know, number one, the IRS is not going to call us on the phone, and number two, we're not going to pay our taxes with a gift card. Again, the senior is compromised, emotionally compromised at that moment, because they're scared of this, and their faculties are weak, and so they're able to believe these things. And of course, they're threatened with arrest if they don't cooperate, again, making the situation so much worse. Social Security Administration imposters also called older adults, and they claim that the victim's Social Security number has been suspended because of suspicious activity. Maybe it's been involved in a crime. They want to confirm the Social Security number just to make sure, and then the senior gives it to them online. And in a lot of these cases, the perpetrators are using robocalls. They're calling scores of people at once. Then there's you press 1 to speak to a government support representative for help reactivating your Social Security number. And they use what they call ID spoofing to make it seem like it's coming from the Social Security Administration. It can really trick some people who are not sharp enough to recognize that this is not legitimate. And the last 3 scams here that are fairly popular, the sweepstakes, charity, and lottery scams. I've mentioned to you this already. Here, criminals are claiming to work for legitimate charitable organizations to gain the victim's trust, or they again claim that they have lottery or sweepstakes winnings. And I've seen these happen to my clients. Usually there's diminished capacity in these cases. The fraudulent telemarketers are based overseas in other countries. They're calling people in the US saying they've won a foreign prize. They typically identify themselves as somebody important, like a lawyer. And they tell the people they've won vacations, they've won cars, they've won thousands, millions of dollars. The last one I had, it was $1 million prize this guy was going to get. And the winners, of course, have to pay fees for shipping, insurance, custom duties, or taxes before they can claim their prizes. And these victims will pay hundreds, even hundreds or thousands of dollars. Last guy paid over $100,000 in one of these. is they kept coming back and saying, well, you have to pay for your taxes. Well, you have to pay for these sorts of fees before you get your prize. And sure enough, the money went out the door. Unfortunately, criminals appear in person and charge homeowners in advance for home improvement services that they never provide. Home repair frauds have been around for a long time. A guy typically knocking on the door saying, oh, we seal your driveway, or do something like that. They'll try to win over the trust of the individual they're talking to at the door, because a lot of these fraudsters are really great salesmen. They've got personality involved. And so they'll talk about the repairs that can be made to their home or their driveway at a reasonable price. Maybe they'll have to sign various documents. Sometimes the documents are fraudulent. There's actually maybe a deed that they're signing and they don't realize it, a deed to their home. In most cases, however, the work is just simply not performed, or they overcharge for the work. It's some sort of shoddy job that was done, and they take the money and run. And lastly, relatives or acquaintances of elderly victims take advantage of other elderly individuals in a caregiver situation. Caregiver fraud centers on the abuse of trust and vulnerability of an older adult who's dependent on others. When the caregiver enters into the life of this sort of older adult, they usually gain a lot of access, or can gain a lot of access, to the elder's personal and financial information. It's somewhere in the house, and they're rooting around for this information. Now, various ways the caregivers take advantage of the elderly. Some engage in identity theft. So what would happen in that case is they get a hold of the elder's credit card, the bank account information, or personal purchases using these accounts. In extreme situations, they might use the financial information to open up their own accounts. And they take out loans on behalf of the elder. They reap a lot of profits, and they leave the elder with a lot of debt. Sometimes it's outright theft. We've seen this a lot. The financial harm resulting in easy access to financial records can range from just petty cash theft, things go missing in the house, to rerouting of money from the older adult's bank accounts or retirement funds. Other examples of the theft include the illegal forging of the older adult's signature on checks, maybe manipulating an elder into signing checks or agreements that will benefit the fraudulent caregiver. Sometimes the caregiving fraudsters prey on the older person's kindness. Remember I mentioned reciprocity. So they'll spin a story about some financial need, an unexpected bill, or some financial duress, and they'll persist in this story of woe until the elderly victim agrees to cover the cost of whatever they need. And then they'll come back for more again and again. It goes on a lot, unfortunately. That type of fraud is really hard to prove because it looks like gifts. It looks like it was a decision the older adult made on their own to help this person pay for their rent or their car bill or whatever has come up. All right, so how do you protect yourself or someone you care about from one of these scams? We need to educate ourselves and our seniors as to how we can go about protecting ourselves. So here are some of the tips for older adults. Some of these might seem like common sense in light of what I've just talked about, but here's a list of them. If the older adult is going to receive, a request for money or for credit card or bank account numbers, enter anything like sweepstakes or contests, they should not be responding to. They should never give out personal financial information over the phone or over the computer, whether it's by email or other service like texting. Some of them are confused about the Medicare numbers. They think those are different from the Social Security numbers. They're one and the same. They shouldn't be giving out those. And they need to understand that scammers are going to refer to Social Security or Medicare to deliberately deceive them. They need to know that these are bogus companies that want you to believe that they're associated with the government, and they're not. And lastly, of course, if you can convince the senior to do one thing, hang up the phone. The home phones, by the way, are what are typically used to target a senior. Somehow the scammers seem to know that the home phones are where the most victimized older adults may be located. If there's a cell phone, they're less likely to target the cell phone. And of course, there are various ways to screen your phone calls, but certainly hanging up the phone is something we need to educate our older adults to do. If they're not comfortable with doing that, they need to understand that's one way to protect themselves. Sweepstake notices, Other sales promotions asking you to call for more information usually is a trap. You need to educate them this is junk mail. Throw it out. Resist the temptation to act quickly. Even if you get a phone call saying something as horrible has happened to son or daughter, you need to not act quickly to send money to somebody, because fear is what lures people to immediate action. Telling the bogus fundraisers sometimes use names of otherwise legitimate organizations. Have somebody check to see if that's a legitimate charity before you send money in the mail. There's so many seniors are sending $50, $100, $20, $30 to every single charity they get some sort of mail solicitation for. And a lot of them are connected, and so they just keep sending mail to the older adult. Criminals, of course, are involved in the promise for prizes and foreign lotteries. If, in fact, anybody asks you to pay in advance for taxes, customs, administrative expenses, attorney's fees, there is no valid reason to pay any of those to get a prize. So don't be sending money for prizes like that. Play the Pennsylvania lottery if you're going to play a game. Don't be playing one of these games that you get through the mail. And lastly, try to convince them if it doesn't feel right to you. And again, it's tough. If they've got compromised faculties, maybe this piece of advice isn't going to help. But if it doesn't feel right, just say no. If you have somebody who still has their faculties, try to encourage them that no is not a bad word to use. So for you caregivers, you need to maybe in your case, you have to be a lot more vigilant if you're trying to care for an older adult. Particularly one who's suffering from diminished capacity. So here are some suggested approaches to protecting them. Regularly call and visit. Be suspicious of those who have befriended the older adult. And perhaps the older adult not as available as they once were on the phone. And you need to be a little concerned about that. If you live a distance away from your loved one, that could indicate that somebody has entered your loved one's life that's going to have an undue influence over them. Block solicitations. You can block both mail solicitations with the Direct Marketing Association's mail preference service. So if you're getting a lot of junk mail, Direct Marketing Association's mail preference service is where you can go. If you want unsolicited offers for credit stopped, there's a website called optoutprescreen.com. Optoutprescreen.com. So unsolicited offers for credit can be stopped. Robocalls can be reduced through an anti-robocall service. Third-party blocking devices such as do not call lists or a call screening tool can be used. I remember there was something once called a Telezap. You hooked it up to your phone. It would send out a signal to these robocalls that the phone has actually been disconnected. And so they eventually would take you off the list of phone numbers to call, because it appears as if the line is no longer an enlisted line. So that's one option. And the do not call lists, there's a state do not call list and a federal do not call list. They have varying degrees of success with those, but I encourage my clients to sign up for them. Set up safeguards at the bank. Seniors with diminished capacity still want control of their checking account. They still want that checkbook in their hand. They may have early dementia, but they still want to be in charge. So if you're concerned about large checks being written that might be written to somebody who's trying to take advantage of the older adult, maybe you set up a small account for them. Leave a small amount of money in that checking account. Could have a spending limit associated with it. And then move all the other finances into separate, more secure accounts that you might be able to monitor. Obviously, you need a cooperative senior. You need power of attorney in order to manage their finances, but leave them a small amount in their bank account so they can't be victimized. Many of my clients' families have just moved money out of the older adult's name. You can do that with a power of attorney. Arrange for a limited account oversight. Some of the financial institutions are willing to send statements and alerts to a trusted child who's on the account, maybe as power of attorney for the parent, alerting them to large transactions that are occurring. More and more banks have anti-fraud policies, and therefore they're more and more willing to work with you to help protect the older adult. All right, so lastly, how do you report a case of financial fraud? Even if you just suspect fraud, I've been told don't hesitate to report it. something bad that could happen. You have an investigation that goes on that's determined to be unfounded, or maybe there's nothing they can do. Obviously, the local and state police, those are your first lines of defense against fraud. The Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General does have an elder abuse unit. If you go online, there's a website for it, and there's a phone number you can call. So they do investigate cases of elder abuse. The local area agency on aging does investigate elder abuse as well. Frequently, they're looking for physical abuse of the elder, but there's no harm in saying there's something going on here that's not right. They'll go out and investigate, and maybe they will make a referral to the police. The FBI occasionally gets involved in some of these elder abuse cases. The federal government is well aware that it's a national problem, so every once in a while you'll read about a new federal law that's come down, allowing, for example, attorneys for the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute cases of elder abuse. Just a year or two ago, they had a huge crackdown on national organizations that were taking advantage of the elderly. So each year, there's a lot more emphasis on law enforcement to combat these cases. I would say if your complaint is not taken seriously, don't hesitate to reach out to your local state representative. They may be able to direct you to the appropriate party or get other people involved in the investigation that need to be involved. It's really only through the consistent efforts of all of us who know someone who's been affected by these crimes or are affected in our efforts to try and report them that we can make a dent in the enormous amount of financial fraud that's affecting our older adults. And that's going to do it for my materials for this webinar. I want to thank all of you for attending. Don't hesitate to visit our website at paelderlaw.com. We have a lot of great material on there, from blog articles and other information for you. And do sign up for our email newsletter, which keeps you up to date on changes in the law. Thank you again for attending.